First and foremost, we should remember that the war is the creation and indeed the culmination of a long-standing and aggressive U.S. policy of NATO expansion into former Soviet states, especially Ukraine. The backstory of this war is there for everyone to see, laid bare by lectures and interviews of John Mearsheimer, the writing of Jim Goldgeier on promises we made to Boris Yeltsin, and archives released detailing U.S. government representations to Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet premier. So therefore today, in contrast, we want to talk about the more recent past, present, and future of this war. Accordingly, this will be a conversation like a concerto or a sonata of three parts or movements. First, what does the war tell us? What has happened? Where are we now? Second, why has NATO failed so strongly at the strategic level? And look at a proxy war effectively run on denial and deceit. And third, finally, what is to be done and where do we go from here? So, what does the war tell us? What has happened? Where are we now? Colonel McGregor, it's such a pleasure to be able to talk with you today. And let's start off at the beginning. What was the original conception of the special military operation in terms of its goals and the net assessment that allowed Putin to initiate it?
Yeah, I think President Putin decided that all of his efforts to talk us into some level of understanding had failed. And having failed to persuade us that Russia would not tolerate NATO membership for Ukraine and would not tolerate the eventual positioning of NATO forces, especially NATO missiles, long-range strike weapons in eastern Ukraine, led him to conclude he had to go in and demonstrate just how serious he was. I think he made a number of assumptions about how this would work out that turned out to be invalid. One of his assumptions was that the United States in particular, the leadership in Washington, as well as the leadership in Kyiv, would want to negotiate, that they would want to avoid a wider war. I don't think he was prepared for what turned out to be the opposite. So the first going in proposition was, we're going in with limited numbers of troops. We're going a short distance into eastern Ukraine, principally into those areas where the majority of the population speaks Russian. And we plan to demonstrate that we are serious and we want to negotiate. And he outlines certain things that he wanted. Number one, obviously, Ukraine had to be neutral, not a member of NATO, neutrality. Didn't go into great detail about what that neutrality would mean, but probably something close to Austria or Finland. Secondly, he thought, well, there are two provinces that are, or oblasts, whatever you want to call them, that are breakaway, Donetsk and Luhansk, and they should have the right to live as Russians inside Ukraine, have equal rights as as Ukrainian citizens, enjoy some measure of autonomy. And then, of course, there's the issue of Crimea. Please recognize the legitimacy of Russian control of Crimea, which, from the standpoint of the Russians, having conquered it in the 1770s, is a self-evident truth. Now, in addition to that, he also talked about eventually having a Russian representative sit on the equivalent of the Ukrainian National Security Council, simply as a representative of Russian interests to that Security Council. That's about it.
So he would have been not happy, but satisfied with that as an outcome.
Yes. And I think he was quite surprised that there was no real willingness to seriously consider it. Now, we do have evidence towards the end of March, after the war had been going on for 6 weeks, that Mr. Zelensky said, well, we could live with neutrality. And when that word seems to have reached Washington and London,
Right.
Uh,
Boris Johnson
people became incensed,
took a
and
trip.
Boris
Yep.
Johnson represented Washington's interests and said, absolutely not. We will support you to the bitter end. You must stand your ground and fight for every inch of Ukraine.
Oh, apropos of this, why did Mr. Putin believe that this would work? The U.S. had been training up essentially a ersatz NATO force, the second strongest army in
Yes.
Europe after Russia, up to NATO standards, and had spent billions
Yes.
on this enterprise. Now, why would Putin not take that into account?
I think there are several reasons. First of all, Vladimir Putin, unlike his predecessors, really does know something about the West.
Right.
If we go back through many Soviet and Russian leaders over centuries, very few had actually traveled outside of their homeland. That's not the case with Vladimir Putin. And he is predisposed to cooperate with the West,
Right.
not just on a business level, but also in a cultural sense.
His record shows that.
Yeah, so that was part of it. Secondly, he did not want to convey the impression that there was anything Soviet-like about the current state. And so he was not going to send forces into Ukraine that would be destructive.
You mean like Hungary in '56?
Of course. And he gave strict orders to the forces that went in there. I don't want you to kill civilians.
Yeah.
I want you to minimize losses in the civilian population. Try not to destroy infrastructure. And I think his assumption was that we would somehow or another figure out what his intentions were. We were never really interested in his intentions. In fact, from our vantage point, I think we thought this war was manna from heaven. That this was a war that this new Ukrainian army that we'd invested so heavily in could win. And we mistook, the underlying assumptions that shaped the initial operation as evidence for weakness.
So the initial operation that was supposed to be completed within a few weeks turned out to be, in effect, the initial phase of a longer war. And at what point did the Russians and Mr. Putin realize that the Ukrainians, being persuaded to fight what amounts to, from their perspective, total war, did Russia decide to recalibrate?
That's a question that's tough to answer without seeing the
of course.
actual transcripts of the meetings that were conducted. But we know that in April and May there were several meetings and several discussions, because the feedback that was coming from Ukraine, from the Russians living in Ukraine, was very interesting. Because the Russian troops told them, well, we're here to liberate you, but we're not staying. And so the Russian-speaking population said, well, if you're not going to stay, as soon as you leave, if we cooperate with you, the Ukrainian secret police that we call the SBU will come here, shoot all of us in the head.
And this happened.
Yeah, so if you're not going to stay, literally, the hell with you. We're not going to support it. This became increasingly obvious as the war drew on, and that was the first thing. The second thing was we sent very hostile signals. You go back to March and listen to President Biden's speech, which was the famous regime change speech, by accident, that until Putin is removed and this state is transformed into something that meets our standards, there can be no peace. And I think it took a while for that to sink in. And suddenly, by the beginning of the summer, it was very clear that what they had done would not secure Russia.
So what you're describing is not something that Americans really understand, is that when the initial phase essentially ran into a brick wall, there was a transitional period of maybe 6 to 8 weeks in which the Russians recalibrated and reassessed their situation. And then from what we've discussed, they went into a strategic defensive mode in which they held the territory they'd taken in the south, consolidated it by taking Mariupol and then the Lysychansk and Severodonetsk conurbation, and manned it with a relatively small force, a kind of economy of force operation.
Yes, they never had more than 20% of their ground force engaged.
Right.
And that is a very small contingent, about 190,000 troops initially. And then it became clear that that was going to be inadequate because the war was not going to end with the capture of these territories.
Right.
So there, at some point in the summer, there was a meeting between the General Staff, the Stavka, and I think President Putin. And his question was, well, what do we have to do to win this war and
Right.
end it?
Right.
Because the key issue is not just we want to win on the battlefield. We want to win in such a way as we bring this war to a close.
Right. And although severe casualties had been inflicted on the Ukrainian army, or, the original Ukrainian army, the U.S. and Britain were very active in training and equipping new cadre
Yes.
of Ukrainian into effective forces, and this began to be demonstrated in the end of August and into September and October.
Well, people were always shown these marvelous films of
Right.
Russian tanks being destroyed by various things, Javelin missiles, and of course the one weapon system the British are using, this light anti-tank weapon system, which is really very, very good. It's turned out to be much more effective
Than the
based
Javelin, yeah.
than the Javelin, based on the reports coming in. And the Russians looked at all of this and said, well, Mr. President, if you want us to win this and bring this to a close, we have to make fundamental change in all of the assumptions.
Right.
And first and foremost, we have to move over to the strategic defensive. And this is going to have to be, for the time being, an economy of force operation because we don't have enough forces. Not only are you going to have to bring in most of the regular army,
Right.
the active force, we're going to need additional reservists and volunteers. What's really interesting on the Russian side is the enormous success
Yeah.
which they've had with volunteers, not just Chechnya, but also within Russia itself. So this changed the character, but then the decision was, well, if we're going to hold this territory, and this is when Surovikin is named the new commander, he said, I'm happy to hold this territory, but I don't want to be committed to holding every inch of this.
Right.
If I feel it's necessary to withdraw somewhere to economize so that I
Yes.
could be more successful elsewhere, I want to be able to do that. And President Putin said, you are now the theater commander. You are in command. Everyone takes orders from you. So there was a restructuring of the commands to ensure that he was now the final say on any operational item that occurred in the theater. That was not the case earlier.
So the second phase, which was marked initially by an adaptation to the circumstances that the Russians found themselves in, actually evolved during the course of this phase into something more productive than simply holding the line.
Oh, absolutely.
And this is somewhat reminiscent to me of the withdrawal of the German army, which was also outnumbered in World War I, to the so-called Hindenburg Line in 1917, where what the Russians did, the Germans, excuse me, did is leave a barren wasteland that was full of obstacles and mines, and pull back to a position that shortened the front and allowed them to build up a larger strategic reserve. And it seems to me that what you're suggesting is that Surovikin sort of deliberately did this in both the part of the Kharkiv Oblast and also
Yes.
in Kherson Oblast.
Yeah, well, the Russians have an advantage, though, over us in this sense. They understand that ground in and of itself has no real value unless it confers a military advantage on you.
Right.
There's no point in just holding onto ground for the sake of saying, well, here on the map I've drawn a line and I'll go no further, which of course was the Hitlerian mistake that lost the war in the East, or one of them.
Right.
And the bottom line is, he said, look, we're not going to defend something that we can easily retake when we decide it's necessary. We're going to stay where we think we can defend effectively. And so for weeks I was being asked by people, well, the Russians withdrew 10 kilometers here, they withdrew 20 here, and so aren't they in retreat? Is this not evidence for Russian decay and a crumbling defense? Never. It never was. But all of these things were approved by Surovikin. He made it very clear that local commanders had authority to do what made sense, but he was still in command, and these decisions had to be checked with him.
Well, what's interesting is this development during the second phase actually turned into a bonus that would help prepare the way for the third phase, which was the development of through mobilization, through a unified command, through preparation of the battlefield, a good layout of the land for the fourth phase, which would be the actual offensive.
Well, before we leave this second phase, I think
Yeah,
it's useful to point out that Surovikin is in a position not very different from Montgomery during World War II.
right.
Americans usually scorn Field Marshal Montgomery based on
True.
this ridiculous Patton movie, which was unfair to Montgomery. By Montgomery's actually a very competent officer, but Montgomery was very sensitive to minimizing his casualties. And when Surovikin took over, he made it very clear he would not countenance any frontal assaults. He was not going to waste lives unnecessarily. And I think he got the same level of trust and confidence from Putin
Yes.
that Montgomery got from Churchill. You can do whatever you want. I will give you all the material necessary, and we will do what you say, and we will attack when you're ready. And I think Surovikin is the sort of man that said, I'm not making a move until all of the conditions are met that I think are essential to guarantee successful offensive operations.
Well, could we go through each of the elements of shaping the battlefield? So the third phase quite clearly has been one of mobilization, building up forces, levying attrition on Ukrainian forces to weaken them, perhaps fatally. And then there's also preparation of the battlefield for the offensive. Could you just go through those?
Well, I think if you talk about intelligence preparation of the battlefield, the Russians are not going to make the mistake that they made before they went into eastern Ukraine.
Right.
In other words, they're not going to assume that they're going to enjoy support without commitments that they're prepared to make to the population.
Yeah.
They also understand that infrastructure is important, but not all infrastructure. And they also want to make absolutely certain that they are going to annihilate most of what passes for air defense before they begin this offensive. And that's also, by the way, very reminiscent of the Allies during World War II that went to great lengths to strip away as much as possible the German Air Force. And then finally, I think the buildup of supplies and ammunition, the pre-positioning of medical support, all of those things have been happening, and Surovikin has been personally involved in it. He and Putin, by the way, have actually gone down to the troop level to look at how these reservists are being equipped. Do they have the right winter clothing? Do they have the right set of equipment? Do they have the adequate training? This has been a very thorough process. And what he wants to know at some point is, first of all, is the transportation infrastructure now at a standstill? Have we attacked all the fuel and ammunition storage points?
Right.
Have we eliminated the power grid for all intents and purposes, forcing people to flee because, frankly, from their vantage point, the fewer civilians they have to deal with, the better.
Oh, yeah.
By the way, to their credit, and they never get credit for this, they always bring food and medicine with them when they move into these areas and distribute it.
There's ample demonstration of that.
And no one carries this in the West because we're busy maintaining this narrative of the evil Russians. All of these things are being carefully examined. And when he's satisfied that in each of these categories, I'm sure he probably has a chart somewhere. You know, we sometimes did it in the Pentagon as red, green, or yellow.
Yeah, I know.
He may have something similar to that. Has this condition been met?
Right.
When all of those are met, and of course we're talking about weather, which is no small consideration in that part of the world. And I know that they have been waiting for things to freeze, and they just haven't gotten there yet in the Deep South.
No, you had said at one point to me that it would take 2 weeks at the end of the Rasputitsa for the ground to thoroughly freeze. So you said to a level of 3 or 4 feet.
But now, having said that, we have to go back and re-examine this economy of force mission.
Right.
Which has turned into something much more than an economy of force mission.
Yeah.
They discovered that they could actually induce the Ukrainians to launch counterattacks against them.
True.
And this is the issue that we don't really appreciate in the ground force. We don't appreciate this coupling of ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, with strike weaponry. Not just artillery in the conventional sense, but everything that falls into the standoff attack category. And the Russians have a lot of experience with this. Certainly in World War II, there's this famous event when they had surrounded 50,000 German troops outside of Minsk, which I cover in the book. Zhukov, as an army front commander, was able to say, I want every aircraft available, immediately scrambled to attack the Germans in this encirclement. Within minutes, thousands of Soviet aircraft, bombers, fighter bombers began arriving and pulverizing the Germans. And by this time in the war, they were surrounded by armor. tanks and artillery so the Germans couldn't get out, which historically they've been able to escape.
Yeah, like
well, if you fast forward,
pockets,
if you fast forward in this process,
yeah,
if you fast forward to the present, there are examples of cruise missiles being launched within minutes from the Black Sea, from vessels down there, to strike targets in Ukraine as far north as Kharkov, where there were Ukrainian artillery and anti-tank positions that could not be reached by any other means. And it was done within minutes. There was no lengthy debate with the Air Force. There was no lengthy targeting discussion. It was done.
So
simply.
The productive attrition, both of logistical capability, but also of the forces themselves, is really taking advantage of a period during Rasputitsa where the Russians have to wait. They're preparing the battlefield. And would it be too much to say that the Russians have taken advantage of their famous maskirovka because they've been handed a sort of a receptive West that is willing to believe that the Russians are on the run? Haven't really, I have seen no assessments, apart from you, of the buildup of Russian forces being discussed in the Western media. So in effect, the Western media is handing the Russians the benefit of a big surprise moment by being unwilling to talk about what's actually happening.
Well, I think you could say those things. I'm not sure that we could attribute it to Maskirovka. This is sort of this is a self-inflicted wound.
Yeah, I agree.
But the key thing here, and this is something we discussed earlier today with Roger, and that was see two opponents, one Russian, one Ukrainian, sitting on either side of a chessboard. Each side can largely see what the other has.
Right.
This is something we haven't really confronted in the past. There's not much happening on the Russian side that we cannot monitor with space-based surveillance and all the technologies at the National Security Agency, and all of this information is then fed to the Ukrainians on a routine basis. And we have thousands of contractors, former soldiers, and undoubtedly NATO staffs at lower levels taking advantage of this. But what the Russians did not expect, and this has worked to their advantage, is that they would be foolish enough to launch attack after attack after attack for political reasons, to try and demonstrate that there was life left in the Ukrainian armed forces.
Well, that's sort of a projection.
And if you look at Bakhmut,
what we feel.
If you look at Bakhmut right now, this is the topic in the press right now. Bakhmut is being portrayed as a strategically vital logistical hub, rail, everything. And if it is lost, that conceivably that could unhinge the strategic or operational defense in southern Ukraine. I don't know if that's all true, but what we do know is that the Russians have simply held the cheese out for the mice and said, please come in and defend Bakhmut. So they've held back from actually capturing it in the hopes that more troops would be introduced. They just introduced another 20,000 into Bakhmut a few days ago, half of whom are not Ukrainians. Thousands of Poles, Americans, British, and so forth.
I've heard that the Poles have suffered 5,000 casualties.
I know that these are unofficial reports coming to me from people on the ground in Poland that have relatives in Poland and in Ukraine, and they say as many as 1,000 Polish soldiers may have died.
Well, that would jive with 5,000 casualties.
But this of course is a gift to the Russians, and what's happened now with the economy of force is that the morale down there has risen dramatically, because soldiers are always much happier when they see damage inflicted on the enemy. So instead of simply sitting there and waiting for someone to attack, they've managed to manipulate the battlefield. And with this ISR strike capability, do enormous